Welcome to the All Facts Matter podcast, where we push back against corporate media propaganda with facts, evidence, and data. I'm Peter, the author of All Facts Matter. Let's begin. For last month's Consumer Price Index summary, along with the Producer Price Index summary, I was talking about inflation getting hotter. I explored all the facets that were pushing prices up and were likely to continue to push prices up. Naturally, this month I am talking about inflation getting cooler. And yet, that is what the data has presented for February. Inflation eased noticeably in this Consumer Price Index report, rising just 2.8% year-on-year after posting 3% year-on-year in January. That cooler inflation was then backed up by easing in factory gate inflation, which pulled back to 3.2% year-on-year. What happened to reverse the consumer price inflation signals so dramatically? The short answer: Donald Trump reclaimed the Oval Office. Which is not to say that Donald Trump has a magic wand capable of cooling consumer price inflation in an instant. He does not. Rather, it is to recognize that Donald Trump has begun his second administration by being a disruptor and an agent of change, and the world is struggling to keep up with his changes. Now, there is no denying that the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation report printed significantly cooler for February. Year-on-year, headline inflation dropped to 2.8%, and core inflation dropped to 3.1%. But even at the month-on-month level, headline and core inflation eased off. And the disinflation trend was pretty much across the board. Energy, food, shelter, durable goods, non-durable goods, and even services all posted month-on-month lower increases in February than in January. Short of outright price declines, these are encouraging inflation numbers, and they are unexpected. After all, last month my prognosis was that inflation was rising, and based on factory gate prices, it was likely to continue to rise. Obviously, that didn't happen. Is this simply an aberration and not a shift in the trend? Or has something shifted within the economic landscape? Suffice it to say, Wall Street was not looking for this outcome in the February inflation data either. And indeed, CNN fully expects this to be a one-off because that dastardly Trump is sure to push prices up next month. Meanwhile, NPR felt that Donald Trump had not done enough to cool off inflation. And how unexpected was the low inflation print? Sufficiently unexpected that the normally accurate Cleveland Fed inflation nowcast missed by a surprisingly large amount. Now, the Cleveland Fed's nowcast updates daily based on the ever-shifting economic data. In normal months, by the time the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases its inflation numbers, the Cleveland Fed has largely triangulated on the inflation level for the month. For the Cleveland Fed to miss is a fairly unusual event. Making the cooler inflation numbers even more remarkable is the reality of rising inflation elsewhere in the world. Inflation is still rising in the European Union. Inflation is still moving higher in Japan. And even right next door, in Canada and in Mexico, inflation printed hotter. To be sure, inflation isn't universal, as China once again found itself grappling with the demon of deflation. While inflation is still on the march in most of the world, China does show that it need not be a given. The unexpectedly cool inflation print does invite us, however, to reconsider the supply chain squeeze that seemed to be confirmed last month with a slew of rising commodity prices. And yet, copper prices largely stopped rising in February. Now, it is true that lumber prices continued to move up, but wheat futures fell sharply at the end of February. In fact, commodity prices overall reversed course in the last half of February and began moving significantly down. Oil prices, of course, continue to trend lower in February. And even gasoline futures prices moved lower on the month. While commodity prices in January did point to a supply chain squeeze that was pretty much across the board, February prices point to a significant easing along virtually all supply chains. That easing in supply chains is being reflected in consumer prices. And once again, the Producer Price Index appears to confirm this assessment. PPI for final demand across all commodities showed significant easing in February. And just as the sub-indices within the PPI sustained the existence of supply chain pressures pushing prices upward last month, those same sub-indices also showed those pressures to be easing. Energy, goods, and services all showed cooler inflation levels for February. Only food showed increased inflationary pressures at the factory gate level. And there's no mystery as to why the food is showing factory gate inflation. Egg prices are still elevated and out of control. Yet aside from egg prices, many of the supply chain pressures that were producing elevated consumer price inflation in January eased substantially in February. Now, is this the start of a larger disinflationary trend that will at last bring consumer price inflation back to the Federal Reserve's holy grail of 2% year on year? While that would be a nice outcome, 1 month's lower inflation does not a trend make. It is also possible that, just as corporate media has speculated, President Trump's tariffs and trade war threats will combine to push prices up again. As the stock market's recent roller coaster performance demonstrates, Donald Trump is shaking up Wall Street just as he is shaking up geopolitical and trade relations. And the prevailing sentiment among financial media is that Trump's tariff threats have thoroughly spooked Wall Street investors, creating bear market conditions for many stocks. Now, it is certain that Donald Trump wields a tariff threat as no president has done since the Gilded Age at the close of the 19th century. It is also certain that no president has used tariffs as negotiating leverage on non-economic issues the way Donald Trump has done. We should not lose sight of the fact that Donald Trump's initial tariff threats to Canada and Mexico revolved entirely around border security as well as drug and human trafficking. Donald Trump is determined not to leave the status quo in place. Whether it's his tariff threats, his pursuit of peace in Ukraine, or the creation of Doge, President Trump has been, without a doubt, an agent of change, and even of chaotic change. Are Trump's tariff threats spooking commodities markets the same way they appear to be disturbing equity markets? We certainly cannot rule that out. And as a theoretical proposition, uncertainty over tariffs would create uncertainty in final commodity prices, which would in turn push commodity prices downward. Trumpian uncertainty may very well be what we are seeing in the cooler than expected inflation print for February. However, it may also be that Trump's disruptive presence is catalyzing a reevaluation of actual demand for commodities, in much the way his disruptive presence is catalyzing a reevaluation in Germany of its defense and economic policies. If that is the case, then the disruption arguably will have long-term benefits. However, all such speculation is exactly that, speculation. In the Biden-Harris era, predictions and prognoses were quite feasible because the policies were so unoriginal and unimaginative that extrapolating their likely effects was a comparatively easy exercise. Not so with Donald Trump. For better or worse, his policies are highly original and highly imaginative. Trump's embrace of tariffs is quite a novelty for a post-World War II president, and his willingness to engage in so-called trade war disputes with other countries is spared the novelty label only because it is consistent with his first term in the Oval Office. Economically, as well as geopolitically, Donald Trump has torn up the playbook. He is in every aspect an agent of change, and even a chaotic agent of change. And that makes prediction and prognostication an exercise in futility. It is quite possible that President Trump's trade war threats will cause higher prices, at least for a time, here in the United States. If those threats go off the rails, they may result in an extended period of inflation. If they work perfectly, they may result in bringing consumer price inflation down below 2% for every good and service imaginable. We are not going to know which of these possibilities will become realities until they do. Wall Street had better get used to the roller coaster, because Donald Trump is likely to keep him on that ride for a while yet. And that concludes this presentation. I hope you found this podcast helpful and informative. Please like it and share this with your friends. Word of mouth is how I publicize my work. Please also consider making a one-time donation or becoming a paid subscriber to All Facts Matter. Your support is what keeps this work going, and I greatly appreciate all of my subscribers. Without you, this work would have no meaning. I encourage everyone to be especially generous with feedback. Leave a word or two in the comments section so that we can keep the discussion going and that we may learn from each other. Thank you all for listening, and have a nice day.